Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you. You've lasted the full day and the full session. So now I hope I can just sort of really give an appraisal to the work that has come so far, and then show how we move to the next step. So I'm going to cover a little bit, a brief history of the movement as we know it today. Before posing some key points for discussion, where can we go with obstruction research and what could the future look like? And I know in tomorrow's discussions, in some of the panels tomorrow, some people will be touching on some of these issues. And I hope really that this is a starter for this in the future discussions. So I think it's important really to begin with a history. Some of you, although not necessarily all of you, will know the complete history of the movement. So I'm going to try and just synthesize a little bit. Put simply, the counter movement is, or it's the fossil fuel industry that in 1956, and as early as 1956, they were conducting their own research on the implications of their own and other industries on the environment. In 1956, together, so there was ExxonMobil, there was Marathon Oil Corporation, the Charles Koch Foundation got involved, the American Petroleum Institution, and research institutes such at Stanford University came together and began to conduct and accumulate research on the implications of their industries on the environment, particularly at the time, fossil fuels. Now, over time, these actors came together identifying multiple problems with the fossil fuel sector. And this in turn really highlighted to them, oh, we've got to do something about this. We've got to protect our interests. So how do we do this? Well, that's when they begin to develop their strategic disinformation campaign to undermine the climate science and forestall climate action, which first really developed in the US, but is one which became global. Now, over time, these actors grew to form a concerted operation to undermine climate policy and climate science. Arguably, this was in resistance to the continued growth in the scientific literature, along with the rise of the ecology and environmental movements, to protect business as usual, to protect the fossil fuel economy. At the same time, researchers and academics were starting to notice, well, why isn't something happening? Despite all of this evidence, there is something preventing us from full and complete action on climate change. Well, even a little bit of action on climate change back in the early days. And many of us, although again, not all, I'm introducing you to something new, was the work of McWright and Dunlap in 2000, who arguably made the first deep dive into our understanding of the climate change and counter movement. And they documented the role of several quite infamous think tanks, such as the Heartland Institute and the Hoover Institution, and their role in the dissemination of counterclaims challenging the climate change consensus. And in that study, they divided the findings into three broad counterclaims that were presented by these particular actors. They argued, one, found evidence that the evidentiary basis of global warming is weak and even wrong. That global warming could be beneficial if it were to occur. CO2 is great. It helps plants grow. and global warming policies would do more harm than good. And they contextualized these events. They noticed that there was increased activity post the 1992 UN Conference on the Environment and Development, even more activity in the 1997 Third Conference of the Parties with the development of the Kyoto Protocol. And this is where we saw the first evidence of this mobilization of the counter movement. And what followed has been the escalation and growth of the counter movement, but at the same time, the actions of researchers and activists to establish who these are. And here I've just provided, based on a culmination of existing research, although it is incomplete, a key overview of counter movement actors that we know today. Each of these have their own characteristics, employ their own narratives, operate in different ways, but together they are there actively trying to either directly or indirectly challenge climate science, challenge environmental legislation, and delay action on climate change. They include think tanks, although we've had debates already on the definitional qualities of think tanks, trade associations, professional associations, research institutes and universities, advocacy or front groups, foundations, coalitions of organizations, PR firms directly involved. And then amongst this all, you had the media and the conservative echo chamber. At an individual level, you have protagonists, the protagonists in the conversation. These include climate skeptics, many of which are or were incorporated into the Heartland Institute's global warming experts. Some of these climate skeptics have close ties to or even ex-politicians. And they've even moved into political positions and administrations. For instance, the climate skeptic Myron Ebel, who's connected with several of these think tanks and even on the boards of some of these think tanks, took a role in Trump's environmental transition team. And lastly, collated in this body of actors that present this delaying discourse on climate change are celebrities. And I say celebrities, but often some of these are a bit Z-list. Some of these include Ted Nugent, Victoria Jackson from SNL, and Jeremy Clarkson. If you don't know who he is, he's in the UK. That's all I'm going to say about that one. Now, in operationalizing, the climate change counter movement have engaged in a variety of activities, not least their media presence, the major PR scheme, which was discussed earlier, for instance, in the conference. But what other activities were they engaging in? There were individuals working alongside these think tanks to come up with endorsements, lists and registers of who says that or challenges the climate consensus, who says the science isn't there to support the actions or climate action. They also host conference events, some of which are very orientated to their own little bubble, but some of these are also open to the public. And the most common and maybe the most infamous is the yearly international conference by the Heartland Institute. Within these, there's stories from in this. You can see the sponsorship, all of these different think tanks often sponsoring these events as well as engaging with them. So these are some of the activities but not all activities, but some that the movement have engaged in. Now, the body of literature in the US has really grown. It's become substantial. And I think it's clearly articulated in Bruhl's work and summary presented on a primer for the Climate Social Science Network. And it shows the structure of the opposition in the US, the flow of influence, the funding behind this, how actors have been able to directly or indirectly delay action on climate change. And arguably, it's the most comprehensive set of actors or movement actors in the world, partly because of the unique political polarization, arguably in the US, the role of foundation funding and the opportunities that affords to influence legislation. You've got the crazy echo chamber and the conservative media, both in traditional forms, so historically talk radio, to now to the TV shows, to now even podcasts such as Joe Rogan. I'm going to put it out there, Joe Rogan. Similarly, you've also got a detailed organised history in Australia, and you can look to the work of Jeremy Walker, who gives a really complete and full understanding of the organised opposition that exists in Australia to climate action. And as we've just sat through in the previous panel, there's a body of literature now documenting the role of obstruction and the dissemination of delaying discourse across Europe, where several actors have been identified, individuals as well as think tanks. We can say that as a whole, while counter-movement organisations in Europe are maybe a bit younger, they are still creating their own, or we are still finding our own manifestation of what obstruction looks like. But at the same time, there are some mirroring activities to the US, for example, think tanks and the role of think tanks. Those individuals, those protagonists in those networks that are directly or indirectly connected to some of these large US think tanks. In particular, they're also connected to the Atlas Institute, the mothering organization of neoliberal think tanks across the world. There is also an active media campaign, particularly in the UK. I note the serious role of the Murdoch press in the dissemination of climate skepticism in earlier forms to now more delaying objectives. Furthermore, the connections with the media are also tied into the opportunities afforded by what we call the Tufton Network, the Tufton Street Network in the UK specifically. The Tufton Street Network in the UK is a hub for businesses and lobbying groups where major government actors still engage with, well, they're still engaging with these people. This includes the Institute of Economic Affairs. It includes the co-funded American Friends of the Institute of Economic Affairs. So while we still don't know as much about the European climate counter movement, we still know a lot. It will continue to expand, and we're learning every day. And to this point, or at this point, we can start to summarize the key points of what we know about the movement today. Oil, coal, gas are the key factors, or the key industry sectors behind this organised counter movement. They are behind the historic disinformation campaign led by ExxonMobil, who employed the same strategy as the tobacco industry. There were even actors in the tobacco industry that now operationalize in the climate movement, such as Fred Singer, is one example. There is a series of actors working alongside this, including think tanks, including front groups, that propagate this discourse of delay. They engage in lobbying efforts. This is tied to a series of individual key figures that can often be used as headlines. So they like to make TV appearances. And they together, we have this consolidation of individuals and organizations that are there protecting the business as usual scenario, protecting fossil fuel intensive production and consumption at the behest of both human and non-human life. And then through this historical understanding, we've come to determine some of the key arguments that over time has changed. And Lamatel's 2020 piece really synthesizes that material, dividing these discourses of delay into 4 generic categories. These include emphasizing the downsides of acting, pushing non-transformative solutions, redirecting responsibility, and surrendering to the impacts of climate change. Now, we might think that the flat earthers are gone, they're still there, but this group of delaying discourse really shows how we've moved into the different, or we shifted or come to shift our understanding of what we mean by denial, climate denial, as well as climate obstruction. So with this in mind, that's our sort of brief summary in history. So now I want to turn to some of the next steps. And as I go through the rest of the presentation, I want to focus on 3 key areas, what we could look at. 1, we can look at the changing discourse of obstruction in the global north. There is limited to what we know of research on obstruction in the global south. We're starting to see links around the transnational dimensions of the movement. And maybe we also need to confront solutions, non-solutions, and technological determinism that seems to be dominating some of the language today in how we respond to climate change. So back in 2018, I created or tried to create a sort of attempted an initial international census of the obstruction movement. And this was essentially based on a culmination of existing research. Now, there are deficits to this data in so many ways, yet methodologically and theoretically, it sort of spoke to me that we need to move beyond the UK, Europe, and the US, Europe, and Australia. Specifically, we maybe have to think about new conceptual starting points when we think about the climate change counter movement. So with that in mind, one of the first places to move forward with, or that it took me, was to then look at who are those people outside of the US, Europe, and Australia. And the first place I found this information really is when we look back in history to 2006, 2007, where we saw the consolidation of a group of think tanks to form a coalition organization called the Civil Society Coalition on Climate Change. This organization first appeared online in 2007. And while now it's a defunct organization, it showed that there was this emerging international effort to challenge the consensus on climate change using counter proposals, producing several op-eds and policy papers. Within this coalition of organizations, you had think tanks from Brazil, China, Guatemala, Nigeria, South Africa, Panama, Argentina, Uruguay, Costa Rica, Pakistan, Peru, Chile, the Philippines, and India. So just in this think tank model, we began to see that this expands, this obstruction activity is potentially global in nature. And to me, that sparked something. It sparked an understanding or some questions on what role do global commodity chains play in this obstruction movement? What do the access to goods in a globalized economy mean for obstruction actors? It's integral that in a globalized economy, or for the climate change counter movement and actors wanting to protect the fossil fuel sector in particular, it's important that those connections between different countries, developing trading relationships, expanding and gaining opportunities to access resources from resource-rich lands, particularly in the global south, continues. It needed that foundation and that support to access resource-rich and arguably ecologically harmful, when we think about the impact of fossil fuels, resources. And we can see how this connects, for instance, to these think tanks. So the Instituto Liberdade in Brazil is one of many Latin American think tanks that came together in official forums and conferences. At these conferences there have been politicians. Over time, they have become more openly partisan, engaging more in conversations on economic liberalization and expanding market opportunities, particularly within resource extraction in the global south. This organization has previously received funding from the conservative right-wing foundation, the Pierre and Enoch Goodrich Foundation. This foundation has also supported multiple right-wing think tanks outside of the US. For instance, the Center for the Dissemination of Economic Thinking in Venezuela. These organizations have presented climate delaying discourse. Often, this climate delaying discourse is a regurgitation, although not in all cases, specifically on climate change, from the US. There are also connections to the Atlas Network, and the Atlas Network are part and help support the rise of this neoliberal think tank collective. And they, for instance, have supported think tanks or conferences such as the Asia Liberty Forum. And in that forum in 2017, a coalition of organizations came together, including those from the US, in co-funded institutes, along with the likes of the Pakistani Liberty Institute and minimal government thinkers in the Philippines that have all previously engaged in the dissemination of climate delaying discourse. As such, this made sure, or came to my mind, that we must look beyond what we already know and particularly expand our geographic lens on counter-movement activities. So it was important to say, yes, there are think tanks and foundation actors emerging in these different countries, but who else? And that made me think, well, where do we go from here? And with discussions in my own head, as well as others, I've sort of developed or thought of ideas on the next steps or research agendas. Specifically, we can look to these think tank models and use the same sort of traditional approaches that come with counter-movement research. But who else and what else are we looking at? Is the denial and delaying discourse in its traditional sense operationalizing outside of these countries? Is it more that the practice of transnational corporations, governments, whether separate or interacting, that are delaying action on climate change? Is there something to do with licensing, investment, the reduction in environmental regulations to delay a cohesive international effort to address climate change? Are they even engaging in forms of overt skepticism? Or are their actions speaking more than their words? Additionally, maybe we need to move beyond fossil fuels. There are other industries that also impact the level of greenhouse gas emissions, as well as other emissions that affect our climate. These include timber, poultry and animals, different parts of the agribusiness, including seeds, grades, that actually fuel our food systems. These also, when used at an unsustainable rate, do have significant consequences for our environment, specifically forms of ecological disorganization. So how do we then look, or who do we look to, and where do we look to think and answer some of these ideas? Well, one place is looking at banks and investments. The recent investigation by the Smog revealed climate skeptic compromised banks that exist around the world. They're operating our global financial system. And they reveal that many of the largest banks have boards of directors closely aligned with heavily polluting industries. With this in mind, this presents a nice contradiction. These organizations are promoting green corporate social responsibility change, yet that's what they keep presenting to the public. Yet when you look at their investment portfolios for their shareholders, where they are asking money to go to, what to invest in, you start to see a different picture to one where they promote renewable energies over fossil fuel and highly carbon intensive industries, as well as some of those ecologically destructive industries when they are overconsumed or overdeveloped. So it presents a question then. How do we navigate this issue of banking and investments? Because behind this, we have a narrative and this understanding that, for instance, investing in particularly the global south increases economic growth. That economic liberalization will help low and middle income nations. It will increase the welfare of the population. However, when we turn to some of the literature on these ideas, such as Furtado, we see that this level of investment, these practices, do not necessarily, I'm not saying they don't, but in some cases, they do not necessarily lead to that growth, that social and economic development for these nations. In fact, some researchers go as far to say that this is a process of underdevelopment. And this underdevelopment has a specific history connected with the extractive industries, where in a global history of investment in extractive industries from the north to the south, we see that purposeful, well, not purposeful, maybe unintentional, uneven and unequal relationship where land is taken from one, yet the fruits and benefits of that labour are not necessarily felt by that population over another. And this type of discourse or this type of concerns have also or can sort of link with the role of licensing and permitting in some of the global south. So licensing and permitting, the ability to reduce environmental protections or even delay the implementation of environmental regulations is well observed in our understanding of the counter movement in the US, in Europe and Australia. But we can also see some of these similarities in the global south, but also in a different context. In this case, I'm going to connect a few examples with the global north, so particularly transnational corporations and some specific countries in the global south. Now, primarily in the research, we had focused on oil, gas and coal sectors. But when we look at do a deep little dive into some of these other areas, some of these other industries, we see some of these projects, particularly around the agri sector, as well as sugarcane sector, and specifically the development of biomass technologies, connected in this narrative and policy program of sustainable development. So some of these projects to build technology that increases the extraction of certain materials in the global south, often or more likely deployed and used by countries in the global north, are connected in some way to transnational corporations and governments. And when you put the tag of sustainable development, we then shift to an area of green capitalism. And this green capitalism that is being now, or we can start to see forged in these connections here, is driven, or we can argue is driven from history. So in the pre-Fordist era, there was the important role of resource extraction by the global north in the global south, historically tied to settler colonialism. In the Fordist and now post-Fordist era, the expanding role of commodities. And this meant an increase in consumption and extraction of resources. What followed then was this need for, well, not need, but where we are now, where we have seen global north governments, as well as transnational corporations, as well as large international actors, such as the IMF and the World Bank, investing in programs related to renewable energy, related to renewable energy for sustainable development to increase economic development in these countries, as well as supply the goods to the rest of the world. But the fact is that these were connected to companies such as Chevron, Shell, and Exxon. In fact, in the 1980s, Shell in particular supported and developed a push for a technological program in Brazil in particular, although it did happen, something similar did happen in Colombia and the Congo, and funded research and development into the development of biomass technology. This project later became supported by the Global Environmental Facility, which sought collaborations from the World Bank and new UN initiatives. And while they were driving this sustainable economic growth, this program of activities, we then actually saw them at the same time deny climate change or present delaying messages on climate change to most of the public outside of these locations. The next part of this problem, however, and how I conceive this as a problem, is connected to the fact that the development of biomass projects, for instance, are connected to the large increases in deforestation and subsequent legislation changes in rural areas, particularly in Brazil, Colombia, and Congo. And this is developed to expand business interests. Now, this is for large-scale producers, not small-scale producers. And I note that explicitly because of the unsustainable levels of extraction. And these actors have continued to engage in the political process. They have even had access to policy actors. Now, in 2000 to 2015, for instance, in Brazil, we had a change where environmental legislation got put in place to protect these rural communities, and in particular, these indigenous communities, which was where that forest land was. And there was less of those potential conflicts existing. However, with recent changes, the 2016 changes where Bolsonaro was elected, and something happened similarly in Colombia, these legislative actions, these environmental and land rights legislation have been proposed and pushed to be weakened, expanding opportunities for the appropriation of land from indigenous communities without compensation or recognition. It's essentially leading towards the pillaging of theft of knowledge, as well as the homes of these people. And supporting this, the languages of discourse and delay. One quote comes from the Brazilian vice president in 2020. And in a discussion on the environment, he argued that the ownership confusion was a major cause of deforestation. If we don't know who owns the land, we can't bring them to justice. So we can't bring these indigenous communities to justice. However, at the same time, he said that this type of activity, this development activity, would help because this is crazy. They had inherited a country that was indolent. So an indolent native population. So this language stemming from the history of land rights, the land acquisition of natural resources, is tied into, or we can argue is tied into, some of these obstruction activities that might exist today. But this is just one example. We can also look to diverting our attention from the big polluters to us individuals. Naomi and Jeffrey's recent work exposing the role of ExxonMobil was foundational in this. But we can also, so we see how these companies have engaged in a PR scheme, sometimes at the same time greenwashing their companies and sort of pushing the responsibility of climate change onto us. For instance, British Petroleum, well, they were the first to introduce the carbon footprint. This is a company that we can deduce what this company is, and pushing that responsibility rather than taking some responsibility themselves and addressing the problems with their industry is a problem. And we can look to more examples of that. We can also give credit to those that do engage in sustainable corporate social responsibility. They've got a corporate green responsibility, but we also have to be careful that we don't fall for this individualization or individualizing the response to climate change. And lastly, we need to look at decision-making on energy transitions. Specifically, we can look to international platforms and how they are determining agendas, how they are agenda setting, and also who is agenda setting. So, for instance, in the US, organised obstruction has reached the highest levels of government and continues to influence debates today. Does that then impact the international body, how individual countries and how policies, international agreements are forged? Who are the figures behind these actors? What are the political ideologies or the ideological approach taken by these actors, and how does that influence these large decision-making processes? The first keynote really touched on some of this when it came to the European Parliament. And alternatively, and something that really, really bugs me, and I think that might be my biases coming out, is the promotion of technology as a solution to the problem, rather than using technologies that we have now, as well as the political will to address or to say we don't need fossil fuels anymore. So there's some of the ways in which we can think about expanding our knowledge or understanding or form research agendas on this movement. So in all, researchers, activists have helped uncover and document the history and evolution of the climate change counter movement. And this conference is a testament to that historic and ongoing work. With that, I want you to take away some key conclusions and points. We know that delay and obstruction is maybe or was the product of a historic disinformation campaign that is intertwined with the structure of our political economy. The success of the movement has not simply been money, rather power. Specifically, the power to engage in decision-making and political action. For instance, the framing of the power to engage in decision-making and political actors. The opportunities to engage in non-decision-making, specifically in the form of agenda setting, for instance, the framing of fossil fuels as not that bad, or can be, or technology can help, as well as the focus on markets as a legitimate form to help stimulate renewable energies. And lastly, ideological power, the ability to influence people's wishes and thoughts, even though they may oppose our own self-interest. Now, what gives me hope is that we seem to have some sort of international action on climate change. However, we are still stumbling blocks to progress. And this is why we need continued research and campaigning that navigates the issue of climate obstruction, climate change denial, how these counter movement organizations are operationalizing, how they are connected to the media, policymakers, as well as how they are connecting to the public and its influence on the public. Thank you.